All right, so then let's switch to going into a little bit more detail about hearing. So again, remember hearing, very similar to vision in the sense that it's just these waves of energy that are traveling through the world. So the sound waves, they travel through air, they eventually make their way to your ear. And again, very similar to the eye was focusing light onto the retina. The ear and all of its structures are basically trying to focus those sound waves into a structure called the cochlea. So you have, the outer ear, which is called the pinna. That's the kind of like fleshy part we think of when we think of the ear. That's constructed the way it is to try to basically like funnel sound into your auditory canal. So there's, these waves of sound coming in. They go down the auditory canal. They eventually hit your eardrum, which the fancy name for that is the tympanic membrane. Same thing though. That eardrum starts to vibrate just like a drum. And then those vibrations are translated to these three little teeny tiny bones in your ear. I think they're the smallest bones in the body actually, called the ossicles. And they're named after their shapes, basically. So there's one called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. I can't remember the English translation. It's like a hammer, an anvil, and a stirrup, I think, because those are kind of what they look like, basically. But those three little tiny bones vibrate and they start to amplify those sound waves, and eventually it gets sent through this little hole called the oval window and then into the cochlea. Okay, and the cochlea is kind of analogous to the retina in the eye. It's where we actually have neurons that are going to start making sense of all this sound information. So the cochlea is this kind of snail shell shaped structure. Snail shell shape, say that 10 times fast, it's really difficult. But if it's, first of all, it's filled with fluid. So it's got this very specific kind of fluid in it. And as those sound waves come in, they travel down all the structures we talked about, they get amplified. Those sound waves basically disrupt the fluid in the cochlea. So in the cochlea, that fluid starts to kind of slosh around in whatever direction, depending on the sound waves that are coming in. Inside the cochlea, it's lined with all these neurons that are called hair cells. So here's another type of neuron that is very strange looking. This is basically what would be like the dendrites of the neuron. So this is kind of like the head of the neuron, basically. So these are lining all inside that cochlea. So again, sound goes into your ear, vibrates all those bones and the eardrum and all of that, disrupts the fluid in the cochlea. So then that fluid starts to flow across these hair cells, and it's basically pushing them back and forth, okay? These hairs that are on top of the hair cells, they're all connected to each other with these structures that are called tip links. Don't know who named them. I feel like it's a silly name, but whatever. So you can kind of see them here. They're like these little chains that connect each of the hairs. So if the hair starts going that way, basically the hairs are going to pull on each other. And there's these little receptors, kind of like the receptors we talked about earlier when we were talking about synapses. There's little receptors that are connected to those chains. So as the hairs move and those chains pull, it actually physically pulls those receptors open, kind of like pulling a door open. And then that allows, all the fluid and stuff from the ear to flow in there, which causes the hair cell to start firing. And then, if it goes the other way, it'll kind of close up that receptor so that the fluid can't flow in anymore. So as you hear my voice, you're listening to me talk. It's literally just a bunch of little hair cells in your cochlea, just like sloshing back and forth, little chains pulling them open. It's kind of crazy that that's like the core foundation of our entire perception of sound. But yeah. All right. Any questions about how sort of hearing works in the cochlea? And then I didn't put pictures or a slide, but it's kind of similar to vision where, from the cochlea, there's a nerve that goes to the auditory cortex, goes to the thalamus first, technically, and then to the auditory cortex. And the auditory cortex starts making sense of all that information. There's also, very similarly, with hearing, there's like two different streams. There's one that makes sense of where the sound is coming from to localize it. And then there's another one that makes sense of like, what is this sound? So there's a lot of parallels between the visual system and our auditory system. Any questions about hearing? We're going faster than I anticipated, so feel free to ask me questions and we can go on little side tangents. So for other senses, I went very, very brief here. Basically just listed them out. Again, we don't know a ton of information about these other senses and how they work. I would say somatosensation we're starting to figure out pretty well. So somatosensation, like I was talking about earlier, that's kind of this class or family of senses that involve, touch basically. So there's physical touch, there's, we can sense like pressure and texture and vibration, and there's lots of different receptors that are all very weird looking that are devoted to processing those different kinds of touch basically. Pain is also usually classified as being separate from touch. And pain is sort of done through a class of receptors called nociceptors. And they are, again, very different from all the other receptors, that are involved in somatosensation. Itch and temperature, again, also typically thought of as kind of like separate sensory systems. Probably another sort of justification for separating them out that way is that there are ways where you can get like damage to a very specific area of the brain or specific area of the spinal cord and like knock out one of these senses, but the rest of them be intact. So there are people, for example, who might not be able to feel touch like pressure or vibration, but they can feel pain, they can feel itch, they can feel temperature, and vice versa. So that's maybe another reason that they get kind of separated the way they do. There's actually a disease called analgesia or congenital analgesia where people are born without, basically their pain receptors are mutated to the point that they don't work, which to most people, if you don't know anything about it, sounds like maybe that would be kind of awesome. Like if I could go through life without ever feeling physical pain, then like that'd be pretty sweet. But in reality, I see a few of you grimace. Maybe you've heard the stories or you can just, figure it out. But it's not a great condition to have because often those people will, very young, will have all kinds of accidents and things that happen. If you've ever been around toddlers, they're very clumsy and do all kinds of crazy things. So people who have had it typically will get some kind of injury and then they're not aware of it because they don't have a pain system telling them, hey, this thing hurts, you should pay attention to it. So it gets infected or it gets, progressively worse. So most people who have congenital analgesia have pretty poor prognosis. They often don't live past like 12 or 13 just due to like the number of injuries that they accumulate over time. So you should be grateful that you can feel pain is basically the point of that. Trying to think if there's anything else particularly interesting about somatosensation I want to talk about. Any particular questions about it? Yeah, Scott.
I was going to say, there's actually, the whole thing with the funny bone is because actually there's no receptors for pain in that area. So when you hit that spot, it's actually your brain going like, what the hell is going on
like trying to make sense of all that information. I've never heard that there's no pain receptors. That's interesting. But yeah, but it's also just like bare. It's like most of our receptors have some sort of something covering it, and that's like very exposed and vulnerable. So if you hit it the right way, then yeah, your brain just like gets way too much input from there and like tries to make sense of it. Anything else about somatosensation? All right, the other one, like I said, are the chemical senses. The two that you named off that are pretty well known are taste and smell. I would say out of all the senses, those are the ones we know probably the least about. So like, we were talking about color perception in the eyes. There's 3 different cones. And if we can understand how those 3 cones respond to the different wavelengths, we can kind of figure out how people see color. But with smell or taste, let's say smell is the more complicated one. For smell, there seems to be potentially like thousands of different kinds of receptors. So instead of just being 3 different kinds of cones, there's like, this huge array of different receptors that respond to chemicals in very different ways. People have tried to kind of map out like, okay, this receptor responds to these particular kinds of molecules. Like maybe it gets really excited by like acidic molecules or whatever. But then that same receptor always has something like weird and surprising that doesn't fit that pattern. So there's just not very good like theories or ideas that fit the data that we have for smell or for taste. They do also combine, so taste and smell are very, they work in synchrony with each other, maybe more than any of the other senses do. So, you've all probably experienced that if you get a cold or something and like your nose is stuffed up and you eat food, it doesn't taste right. You can still taste it technically, because taste really is just like salt, sweet, bitter, sour, umami. There's maybe other tastes that we're still discovering. But if you lose smell, then you lose all that like aromatic nuance to food, so that it doesn't have the same flavor that it normally would. And there's actually areas in the brain that like their whole job is to take information from taste and from smell and put those together to give you kind of the sensation of flavor. Does anybody know what the common chemical sense is? There's another fancy name for it, but I forgot it when I was making the slide and got too lazy to look it up. I think it's something, I don't remember. You all know it, you just don't know that you know it. Common chemical sense is basically a sense that detects irritating chemicals. And it's separated from taste and smell because the receptors for it, it's found in your mouth and in your nose, but it's also found in like your cornea. It is the thing that's triggered if you cut onions, for example. So that's why you cry when you cut onions, is because there's these little receptors in your eyes, in your cornea, that pick up on those irritants. Common chemical sense is also triggered by capsaicin, which is in spicy food. So spiciness is also sometimes separate from taste because it's using this common chemical sense instead of like our typical taste buds.
So is this location dependent, or in what areas is common chemical sense? Where would you distinguish if you're just being like, you know, if you have a bit of some kind of irritating chemical on your skin? Would that just be part of pain, or would that be chemical sense as well?
I believe that's separate from common chemical sense. I can't remember if that's classified like an irritating chemical on your skin. I can't remember if that triggers pain. I know for sure it triggers itch, but it also probably triggers pain as well, depending on what it is. But I believe the receptor for that is completely different from the one I'm talking about for common chemical sense.
Is the common chemical sense location dependent then? And so you're saying it's like eyes, or if you're like getting the onion stuff in your eyes, or you feel the capsaicin in your mouth. Is it specifically in like those areas?
Yes, yeah. My understanding is that those receptors are only found like in your, I think they line, like they're all over in your mouth, not just your tongue, and then in your nose and in your eye, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure they're only found in those locations, yeah. Any other questions about those, about the chemical senses? And then the last one I kind of briefly mentioned is your vestibular system. Your vestibular system is actually very similar to the auditory system that we talked about, and it's actually like connected to the same structure. I don't remember if it was in that picture or not, but sort of connected beside the cochlea, there's these 3 loops that are called the semicircular canals, and they're pretty similar. They're filled with fluid, just like the cochlea, and they have little kind of hair cells that are similar. And so basically, as you like move through space, like if I tilt to one side or I'm falling or whatever, then the fluid in those canals, it kind of like tells me in 3 dimensions how I'm moving. So they're arranged, you know, like perpendicular to each other in all 3 planes. And so as you're moving or whatever, that basically tells you how you're moving through space. So it contributes to your sense of balance and also your sense of like motion. Yeah, Margaret.
For the common chemical sense we're looking for, is it trigeminal chemoreception?
Yes, that's it. That's the word I couldn't remember. Thank you. Trigeminal chemoreception, right? Yes. I'm trying to think. I feel like there's other senses probably that I don't have listed here.
What about sense of time?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I've never heard that listed as a sense in the same, you know, context that we're talking about. I'm wondering, because with all senses, there's always also like a sensory organ and a sensory receptor. And so I'm trying to think what the sensory organ or receptor for time would be, and I don't know what that is.
Routine and memory?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of based on like patterns and associations, but it also seems like, I know there is a part of the brain in, I want to say in the hippocampus, that's really important for tracking time, that's highly tied to memory, and is actually affected by THC, by marijuana. So if any of you, I'm sure none of you ever had, we're in Washington where it's legal. I have to like adjust because I'm from Iowa. So like maybe some of you have smoked marijuana before. If you like lose sense of time, like maybe you're having a conversation and you feel like, I don't know, like you forget what you were saying and you feel like you were talking about it for a really long time or whatever, then you might have that kind of like, you lost track of time basically. And that's because it's interfering with the hippocampus. So I know there's a part of the brain devoted to it. I just don't know like what's the sensory receptor. I'll write that down and look into it. Any others anyone can think of? Any other senses or things you might have thought of as senses? Yeah, Margaret.
What about the like phantom pain from like losing it for an amputee?
Yeah, that actually falls under somatosensation. So essentially what happens whenever someone has phantom limb, like let's say you have your arm amputated, there's a part of the brain in the parietal cortex that receives all the somatosensory information, and it's kind of like a map of the body. It's often referred to as the homunculus, so if you want to look it up, you can see pictures of what I'm talking about. But it's like a map where, you know, there's a very specific part of the brain that responds to like your face or to your arm or whatever. And that map isn't laid out exactly like the body. Like, you know, there's parts where the forearm is really close to like the face, for example. So the part of the brain that responds to the face is really close to the part of the brain that responds to the forearm. So let's say you get your arm cut off. That part of your brain is still there. It's still alive. It's still functioning probably. So if like you stroke your face, then those neurons that control sort of face sensation are going to light up and become active. And they're going to send activity to their neighbor, which might be the forearm. So then whenever your face gets stroked, it feels like someone's touching your arm, even though your arm isn't actually there. So that's what causes that phantom sensation. Yes?
Why would that not happen if you do have your arm?
Because whenever you have your arm, there's actual like competition from another limb, right? So like when I have my arm, there is sensation coming from my arm to that part of the brain. So there's like a competition that causes it to only be active when the arm is actually touched. But if you lose the arm, you lose that competition. That part of the brain is still kind of almost like hungry for activity. So it'll get it from wherever it can, basically. Good question, though. Any others? These are all very interesting side tangents that I enjoyed very much. I hope at least a few of you enjoyed it as well. So, yeah, Scott.
What about the perception of like gut feeling?
Like gut feeling in the sense of, like metaphorically, like you feel like something bad is going to happen?
Yes.
Oh, I remember reading like something about it a really long time ago, but it's been a very long time. And I remember, the one thing I remember about it is that it is literally tied to your gut in some way. Like there are actual neurons in your gut that help like, you know, determine if you're hungry or like if digestion is going properly or whatever. And I remember something about that feeling, like activating those. So there's like, you know, a historical reason for why we call it that, but I don't remember very much else about that sense. Yeah.
Based on what Margaret was asking about the sense of time thing, it brings up a good point of where do we call something a sense, and where do we make that cutoff line? Because
Right.
I think of sense of time, and I'm like, yeah, that is like we say sense, but to me that's very internal within the mind, whereas a sense has to come from some kind of sensor.
Right.
In my thoughts of simplifying that.
Yeah.
But where is that line drawn on? You know.
That's a great question. I would say, like, if you're talking very, like, formally within the field of sensation and perception, you know, the definition is that it's some sort of sensory organ or receptor. So basically, like you're saying, like, if there's some sort of external receptor in the body that's receiving that information, then that typically is going to be classified as a sense. Sense of time, I think the complication is that it's almost like flavor, which I was talking about, it's a combination of taste and smell. It's like sense of time is more like a combination of memory and associations, like you were talking about. It's also highly tied to our like circadian rhythm, which comes from, you know, day and night cycles and hormonal shifts throughout the day and all kinds of things. So I think because it's such a combination of so many things that it's like too complex to be a sense.
Yeah, it's
probably.
Like a conclusion your mind draws based on other senses around.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I would say. But it's not something I've looked into extensively. All right. Anything else? These were all very good conversations. So thank you all for being engaged and contributing. Always makes it more fun for me and hopefully for you.